All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the program. Daniel Greenfield is my guest this segment. Daniel is a Shillman Journalism Fellow at the Freedom Center. He's an investigative journalist. He's a writer who focuses on the radical left and the Islamic terrorism. You've been doing a lot of work, Daniel, lately on the effects of the planned riots and looting in the big cities in the United States, and how that's playing out, and how it very well may play out in New York City. But before we go there, I just want to talk briefly about your article about the fact that today Twitter has deplatformed something like, I don't know, 300 sites that are related to the QAnon movement, and they have shadow banned other sites that ascribe to the QAnon, which is something that I know nothing about. I'm having difficulty finding out about it. I know the New York Times did an article saying very little actually, which is typical of the New York Times. I mean, other than that they're horrible and that they are somehow connected to President Trump and that they're involved with some, rather nebulous conspiracy theory. Uh, I know that you're not an expert on it. I know that that's not the main topic of your article, but could you give me a little bit of information that you may have on what the QAnon is and what it isn't?
So Twitter banned approximately 7,000 accounts. It shadow
Uh,
banned multiple other accounts. As you mentioned, has banned links to various QAnon sites. Again, this is not my area. This is not something I know much about. I'm not one of the QAnon people. That said, the underlying issue here is that basically the left declares that certain views, certain ideas are off limits, and it backs it up with claims of extremism, with claims of harassment. Meanwhile, Twitter is very much a forum for leftist harassment, for leftist social justice mobs. Twitter has allowed all sorts of content that is blatant harassment by leftists to stay up, and yet it claims that QAnon is engaged in harassment. I've seen any number of QAnon people on Twitter. I have not seen any of them engage in harassment, which is obviously anecdotal. At this point, pretty much any political movement is going to be engaged in a certain amount of harassment. The bottom line is Twitter, like most big tech monopolies, is enforcing its rules selectively, which is the real issue, because Twitter, Facebook, Google, these huge marketplaces of ideas have become really our infrastructure of political dialogue, and they are incredibly biased and tilted toward one side. And when we talk about election interference, this is the most blatant example of election interference, when you have huge corporate monopolies tilting the political playing field one way or another.
and I think they clearly are doing that. As far as QAnon, again, I know nothing much about them, but I do follow them occasionally, and I've never seen anything remotely like harassing anybody, or involved in anything that would be by conventional standards seen as in violation of community standards, and yet they're being deplatformed, which gets to the issue you're talking about, Daniel, and that is the removal of and the deplatforming of any conservative opinion, certainly any opinion that is supportive of the president. And I think it's going to get a lot worse as the election gets closer, especially now that it looks like President Trump is closing the gap. Even the liberals are admitting this at this point. And it's just going to get really ugly, I think, because of that. Because these, and again, I say this with a good deal of trepidation, because after all, they're carrying my show, So and I appreciate that, even though I've diversified into many, many different silos, as it were. But they are, hurting and deep, and taking the analytics away from conservative opinion.
They're doing this on a large scale, and while obviously we at the moment can function, it's a matter of the onion being sliced thinner and thinner, and more deplatforming happening. So Google, for example, effectively buried my articles in search results for my own name about a month ago, and this is not a coincidence because this happened on two separate sites. So this is something that slowly sneaks up on you. It slowly sneaks up on you. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not all conservatives have been banned on Tuesday the 4th in August. Rather, it's that more and more people are running afoul of the various algorithms of the various moderation policies, and there are variations within the various companies and within their various sub-platforms as to how they apply them. We saw a very creepy Google test recently, which actually removed a whole bunch of conservative sites, including Breitbart, from the internet entirely. They're claiming that, of course, it's non-ideological. There was nothing political there, which is, of course, what they always invariably claim. Now, Twitter is particularly the most egregious of the various big tech companies, precisely because its Trust and Safety Council pretty much straightforwardly consists of leftist activists. Facebook, on the other hand, meanwhile, is facing a massive boycott, a massive advertising boycott. This is a story that's being very much underreported in the conservative media, but it's enlisted companies, everybody from Verizon to Unilever, which is pretty much everything in your home, stuff like Lipton tea or Axe body spray and Dove soap, Honda, Coca-Cola, countless other companies. They're boycotting Facebook ads until Facebook agrees to censor conservatives and President Trump. Ought to be a huge story. The fact that so much of corporate America is now leveraging its power directly to rig the election toward Biden should be a major story. It's not being talked about, which is kind of a problem with the conservative commentariat in general, I would argue. But it also really shows just how much and how far the left is willing to go. We've seen major pandemic lockdowns. We've seen major riots. All these have decimated the economy and destroyed the confidence of the middle class. And the election is not here yet. So we're just getting started. The left has made it clear that they're going to pull out all the stops and do anything that they can.
And, the corporations, of course, are at least theoretically answerable to their customers. And their customers are not all left wingers and not all so called social justice people. And I think that we as citizens and as consumers could exercise some level of influence with regard to stopping these boycotts. But the problem is we can't know about it because they control the means of communication. And thus corporations are doing their bidding. They're frightened over being attacked and accused by this monopolistic media of having something against black people or any of the usual ugly attacks. And they want to avoid controversy, whether or not they agree with this movement or not, because they're in business. So they keep their head low and they go along with the agenda. It's just easier that way. It's a very difficult thing to counter. And then to add to it, as you say, conservatives, the conservative politicians, people in positions of influence, they don't want to be attacked either. They don't want to be called these names. They don't want to be destroyed. They want to have, they're going to, kiss the ass so that they can get a little, positive coverage in the New York Times or in the liberal press. They don't want to, stir them up. So they go along with it. So in a way, it's like we're up against colossal forces here. And it is getting worse as we get closer to the election. The only person that's standing up is Donald Trump when in positions. I mean, you and I are standing up, but I'm talking about in a position to do so.
Well, what's going on are two things as far as corporations go. So first of all, what the left does whenever it infiltrates is it takes over organizations, it builds networks within those organizations, and it hijacks them entirely. We kind of had that frame where they were socialists and we were capitalists, and corporate America was going to be on our side. This is obviously a very, very short-sighted view. And indeed, corporate America has increasingly been taken over by the left. Now, one major reason that this has happened is because the corporations really have become much more incestuous. This was a process driven by the internet. Obviously, we have these huge internet giants like Amazon that effectively control retail. There are more invisible companies you may have never heard of unless you're in business like Salesforce, which also have a great deal of power and control and influence. And by the way, all this money goes into financing left-wing and Democrat politics. But it also means that increasingly a lot of the retail market has been decimated. Local retail, local small businesses really have been very badly hurt, even well before this. The pandemic and the lockdowns and the riots, obviously all that have been even more devastating. In some places, about a third of small businesses are not going to reopen, period. All this, of course, means that more and more power is being consolidated by the major big box chains, but those are also potentially endangered. You have JCPenney, for example, going to Chapter 11. At this point, Walmart is the only major retailer that's even able to meaningfully compete with Amazon, and probably about the next 12 months is going to determine whether Walmart is going to fundamentally lose. There are signs, I mean, of Walmart wrapping up its Jet brand, shifting its e-commerce model strongly suggests that's happening. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here as far as that's concerned. But increasingly, we are dealing with a marketplace which is consolidated by a smaller and smaller number of major companies. Those companies are run by an incestuous group of people, which are invariably either leftist or kowtow to the left. And it's also an issue where increasingly smaller parts of the country, not just bi-coastal, but a few major cities increasingly run the country, increasingly determine the country's politics, the country's taste, with very little regard for everybody else, which of course you mentioned boycotts. Increasingly, these companies don't care about boycotts, they're monopolies. There are very few alternatives. This gets to the second part. There are very few alternatives to those companies. Increasingly, you have a small number of, for example, supermarket chains that are, I mean, they may go under different names. It might be Giant Eagle or it might be Ralph's, but they're all really controlled by one or two, three major giants like Kroger's, for example. And they have their own financial arrangements with huge brands like Unilever, which shovel their material, which means actually supermarkets today have much less selection than they used to 20 years ago. If you've ever seen Moscow on Hudson, you have the famous scene where Robin Williams is playing the Russian immigrant. He comes to the supermarket and he's going crazy. There are so many brands. There are so many brands. Today, it's actually the opposite. We're actually looking a bit more like the Soviet Union. There are fewer and fewer brands, and a bunch of the brands are really fronts for the same handful of companies, which means those companies can basically say, we don't care if you boycott us. You can't actually boycott us. You can't get away with boycotting us. You have no choice. You're going to use us. So increasingly,
No, it's becoming, you mentioned the Soviet Union. It was starting to become a bit like the post-Soviet Russian oligarchy, where you have these super rich oligarchs who are rich beyond belief. I mean, these people are, they've got such incredible wealth because they were former communists who grabbed up private ownership after the collapse of the Soviet Union and continued a version of Soviet style policies. Not as bad, but, pretty bad. And it's a trend in this country. I mean, Jeff Bezos today, and I say this as someone who has books on Amazon. I mean, I'm not, we have to speak with trepidation. He's the richest man, they say, in the history of the world by any standards. I mean, and you have a consolidation, as you say, of industries into the hands of a handful of people. I mean, the media now, which used to have hundreds of outlets, is now kind of come down to, I think, maybe 7 or 8 that control the general flow of information. This has happened in other industries, as you point out, the supermarket industry, the retail industry. And the people that are getting cut are the mom and pop, mid-level, small-level businesses, which, by the way, tend to lean slightly more conservative. And I think you're describing the scenario very well. Now, back to the story of social network, which back in the day, I mean, certainly back in the early part of the century, we all thought was going to be the great frontier of freedom. I was always worried about when they would take over, but sure enough, they are. And you have people who have been on the net on YouTube, for example, for years, like Stefan Molyneux, who never hurt a fly. He's never said a negative word about anyone. Completely removed and deplatformed. Hundreds of videos taken down. He had over 1 million followers, all wiped out. He turned on the computer one morning and nothing. Everything gone. Michael Jones. I'm not a fan. I just like his ideas about Israel and whatnot. But he is a legitimate author. He had all of his books removed from Amazon Books. This is, we may not agree with people's opinions, but this is really very authoritarian in nature. What is happening with the few survivors of this? Like, for example, Frontpage Magazine. What's happening with Breitbart? What's happening with David Horowitz's Freedom Project? I mean, I would imagine that there must be attempts to try to silence you.
of course, there have been attempts to silence us on a very regular basis. When I mentioned previously that I'd been deplatformed, that included my articles on Frontpage Magazine. The Freedom Center has repeatedly come under attack. One of the groups that came after us was Color of Change, which is leading the Facebook boycott. They actually convinced Visa, MasterCard for a while to stop payments. Thus, this is another area where conservatives are actually ignoring a major issue, which is that you have payment processing largely being controlled by a handful of these huge networks that have connections to banks, thus MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Discover, and PayPal to some degree. And with mobile, you have platforms like Samsung Pay and Apple Pay and so on and so forth, and Google Pay. But it's really a small grouping, and you cut those off effectively. You cannot accept donations. You can't do any kind of financial businesses. And this, by the way, goes beyond controversial groups and personalities. One of the big ideas that the left has was to shut down the firearms industry by preventing them from actually engaging in financial transactions. And they've had some success in convincing major financial institutions, including Bank of America, for example, to simply stop doing business with firearms, to stop extending them credit. And their bigger vision, the guy who came up with this, a guy named Andrew Ross Sorkin, who works at the New York Times, was that effectively you wouldn't even be able to make firearms purchases using a credit card. You wouldn't be able to firearms manufacturers or any company you don't like would not even be able to do any kind of business. And when you look at where the left is going, not just where it is, we know where it is, and really a lot of people even don't know where quite how extreme it is right now. But when you look at what the left wants to be in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that's where it is. They want to completely cut off conservatives and conservative businesses from having any kind of social life, from having any kind of economic existence within society. They want to effectively wipe out conservatives, anybody for that matter who is in any way deemed politically incorrect, from being able to function.
Yeah, I mean they're squeezing the conservatism by its neck by shutting off the oxygen, which is the ability to be paid. And I think it was George Gilder, who was a great intellect he's been looking at and studying the internet for 20 years. He was one of the original people who watched it. I heard an interview with him recently where he pointed out that Google and Facebook have sold out to the communist Chinese in order to do business in China. They agreed to censor their platforms. They agreed to work with China to in their project of giving every citizen in that country a social score. Now, what that means is that when everyone carries a smartphone, they have a score. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but if you have a low score or if you get demerits, you can't function. You can't go from point A to point B. You can't buy certain things. You can't do certain things. You've been targeted. You've been identified. And I suppose in a communist state like China, where you have social workers serving as spies in every couple of blocks, you can be reported on as being politically incorrect and you could disappear. Now, I'm not saying that it's that bad in this country, but George Gilder has said, as in a very prophetic way, that this could happen here with Google, because if they're doing it there, they're going to start doing it here, as are the other social network companies, all of whom generally are of the same mindset. I'm not saying they all sit in some smoke-filled room somewhere and coordinate. There's slight differences, but it's a de facto conspiracy of gentlemen when it comes to the big social players. Do you see that happening here?
Well, I think a social credit system here is effectively inevitable. And one of the gateways to that is the entire public health crisis situation. You have variations of that being used in public health, for example, in the UK and Europe, because when you have nationalized health insurance systems, then you can closely regulate everybody's behavior. And you can make the argument, for example, that which they do in the UK, that if somebody is obese, if they are overweight, if they're smoking, if they're engaging in behavior that is in theory risky, that affects everybody. And the government actually has an incentive to monitor, regulate, and penalize that behavior in some ways. And when you consider the big leftist environmentalist idea of the carbon footprint, everything we're doing in some way factors is connected to everybody else. The amount of food you eat, how far you drive, to what extent you order a product, to what extent you use electricity, all factors in this big interconnected chain. And if you're not doing your part, you're effectively destroying the planet and leading to the end of all life on Earth, which of course is the ultimate emergency. Now remember, the left seizes power largely by declaring that there's an urgent crisis. There's always an urgent crisis. Before the pandemic, they had these massive environmentalist protests, which of course people forgot because we're increasingly an ADD society. And a month from now, they could have the environmental protests coming back. It's all a matter of swapping in one for the other. But they're always declaring that there's an urgent crisis. Right now, there's an urgent crisis of race. There's an urgent crisis of racism. But
All
of
of a
course, their
sudden.
yes, but of course, their uber urgent crisis is the environment, and that is an absolute justification for closely monitoring everybody's behavior, everybody's carbon footprint, and forcing compliance in that regard. And you can apply this to the whole spectrum of various leftist policies. You can have national health insurance. You can have this national racial reckoning, and you can give people social credit scores based on all of those things and factor that in. And of course, the larger question is, how is that being implemented? Well, we already know how it can be implemented. In China, there's a centralized government. Here, we're crowdsourcing it through social media, through a handful of social media monopolies, which effectively monitor everything we do. I mean, you're carrying a smartphone. If you're carrying a smartphone, the smartphone is effectively monitoring you. At this point, any sufficiently modern iPhone or Android is effectively also a smart speaker. A lot of people don't want to put smart speakers in their homes. The basic reality is, unless you take care to disable it, and probably even if you do, there's evidence, the phone can effectively monitor your conversations. It can effectively track the sites you go to, everything you do. And for that matter, as far as internet provider goes, increasingly it's a handful of cable companies, a handful of wireless providers, which are also, again, their politics is very, very predictable. I mentioned that Verizon is joining the boycott to pressure Facebook. Verizon is the corporate parent of the Huffington Post and any number of other left-wing groups. Left-wing media outlets can be part of these huge mega corporate infrastructures. Conservative media, of course, cannot. You're not going to see the Federalist or Frontpage Magazine or the Daily Caller owned by Verizon or AT&T. On the other hand, of course, AT&T does own CNN.
There has been a lot of talk since the trigger of the George Floyd death, even though that has not been investigated yet, for the defunding of police. And I think in a certain way, it's misleading. They don't want to defund police. They want to take the money and transfer it to so-called social justice groups. I mean, there's a platform in the Biden campaign. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this. It's something you may want to investigate, where he supports, I think it's $150 million or some odd number, to go to this COPS, COPS, which has nothing to do with cops. It is a group that basically will be transferring policing responsibility to, quote, social workers. And in other words, it's going to go to them. It's going to go to the AOCs of the world, who are going to handle policing by monitoring people's behavior and by basically trying to force changes in human nature and whatnot. And this seems to be where things are going. This certainly is where things will go if Biden is, God forbid, elected. And meanwhile, the very threat of defunding police and the shock troops of the left, the Antifa and BLM, who are throwing garbage at police in cities and burning black neighborhoods and looting black businesses and killing black people, uh, the result is that the police are retiring, that they're not joining the police department, that they're not going, that they're taking lengthy leaves of absence, and who can blame them? And so there's a cycle of violence that is increasing in these big cities, including New York City. And there doesn't seem to be any will on the part of the mayors and the governors, either deliberately so or just because they don't know what to do anything about it. So President Trump is talking about federal interference, and that is being demonized. What say you with regard to where this is going?
So the important thing to understand about the whole defunding the police movement and what it's really about. The left obviously wants police. The left cannot function any other way than a police state. But we use the term police state without really thinking about it. When the left talks about defunding the police, what they mean is transforming policing for one that is focused on stopping crime, particularly property crime. Remember, the left doesn't recognize the idea that property crime is even an issue. Now, when we go back to the Soviet Union, the communists had a particular philosophy on crime. The people who were at the top tier, the people who were there most justifiable, were actual criminals. Thus, the people, for example, if you were sent to a gulag, the actual criminals, and including the extremely violent criminals, were at the top of the food chain because they were considered to be victims of this capitalist system. The people who were the real criminals, of course, were political offenders or people who had in any way interfered with the functioning of the state, even in non-political ways. If you came late to work, that was sabotage. If you were stealing stuff from work, which everybody did, that was also sabotage. That was the real crime. People who were just attack people individually as criminals were not considered the real bad guys. This is the same idea that the left has. They want to defund police, and they want to transform policing away from actually policing crimes against individuals, particularly against property. They repeatedly make the case during the riots that property can't be more important than somebody's life. Even if you worked all your life for this particular piece of property. You have the McCloskeys being indicted because they actually used firearms to threaten people who invaded their private property. So their vision is to actually have the police monitor what they consider to be politically incorrect behavior. They claim that speech is violence, for example. So anybody engaging in politically incorrect speech would be closely monitored. Meanwhile, the people actually engaging in violent crime, they would largely get a pass only if they go too far, and the police would have limited ability to intervene. And the police, we're talking about people who are basically little bureaucratic toadies. I mean, if you look at the police in the UK, you have these 5-foot-tall men and women who are soft-spoken, they're disarmed, they don't have guns. They will come to your home if you post something politically incorrect on the internet about Islamic terrorism. But the actual Islamic gangs, Islamic terrorists, they're completely helpless against them because they don't even have weapons. These are guys in yellow vests. They can't do anything. And this is the sort of situation you see in Europe. This is what they want to bring to America. They don't want this 6-foot-tall guy with a gun there to stop gang members. They want the gang members running free. They want the terrorists running free. What they want is for, if you don't actually recycle, then yes, 4 of these guys will come to your house. They will lecture you in very snide voices. They will give you tickets. This is what their vision of the police is.
Wow, and this is they're pushing as the main kind of keystone of their agenda the idea of hate crime and hate crime legislation, which is something that is completely un-American. It runs against our entire system of jurisprudence. In America, you are not charged with, you cannot be convicted, at least traditionally, of anything that involves thought or speech other than as Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, yelling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, if you could show that someone's speech against a person resulted in violence or damage, that there are laws against that already. It's called slander. It's called libel. But they want to criminalize, you know, political opinion, basically. And this is the hallmark of a communist country. This is what they do in China, where, according to Amnesty International, they execute an average of 50,000 people a year for political crimes. In other words, crimes against the state. These aren't crimes like breaking and entering or assault and battery, conventional crimes that we think of here. These are crimes of opinion. These are people like, for example, the Muslim Uyghurs who are in concentration camps right now in China, hundreds of thousands of them being tortured. It's almost like what they did in Nazi Germany, or crimes in Hong Kong where they're just cracking down on anyone that dares dissent from the government. People are trying to get the hell out of there, or they're completely destroying cultures like they're doing in Tibet through very coercive tactics. That's what happens when you have hate crimes. That is something that's un-American. Now, if somebody engages in, an act of racism, I suppose, if they call somebody a racial name in the commission of a crime, then that is legitimate to be used as evidence in a trial against the crime. But that in and of itself should not be the crime. It goes to intent, but it is not the object of the intent. It is a symptom, not a crime, at least in the American system. So they are turning our entire system of jurisprudence on its head. They are turning us away from the idea of crime and punishment when you actually commit a violation of someone's rights and property by harming them or their effects, and they're turning it into that your opinion is harmful to them and that is criminal. That's a communist idea.
So an example is closer to home. Canada and Australia used to have freedom of speech. Then, of course, they got the various hate crime measures, which rendered freedom of speech all but irrelevant. This is something that is very much happening in the United States, and there's a particular justification being used for this, which is that hate speech is so fundamentally traumatic that it's effectively violence, that it causes physical harm, that it actually shortens lifespans for African Americans, that kind of thing. It's obviously pseudoscientific nonsense, but this is the argument that we're seeing more and more, and that we're going to be seeing on a larger scale as this actually becomes a matter of legislative and judicial consideration, which again is coming in a matter of years, which people are absolutely not ready for. Now, crime is, of course, referring to actual violations against somebody's physical body, violations against their property. Speech is not crime, and for that matter, any kind of hate crime and actually a lot of what's being considered hate crimes now are called bias intimidation. Now, bias intimidation is generally a phony category. In the last 5-10 years or so, local police departments were pressured to generate more hate crimes charges but since there are only so many hate crimes, they generate a whole bunch of bias intimidation charges, which can mean, getting a dirty look. It can mean somebody shouting a slur, which is ugly, obviously, but it's not a criminal act per se. Somebody shouting an insult at you is not actually a crime. Yet at the same time, they've created this bias intimidation charge, which is extremely, extremely dubious. And they've used this bias intimidation charge to effectively bypass the idea of freedom of speech. And now you actually have people being rounded up effectively on bias intimidation charges. Now, of course, beyond all that, you have corporations increasingly falling into line, which means you have this video of somebody behaving badly in public, which people should not be behaving badly in public. But at the same time, that video now leads to them being immediately fired, or even to their relatives being fired, which is a very North Korean moment where you're actually punishing somebody's relatives for something they did. Now, nobody should be fired for what they're doing in their private time, and for that matter, platforms should not be hosting these shaming videos. Going back to where we began this conversation with QAnon, social media routinely hosts these shaming videos, whose entire goal is to target somebody for retaliation. It's to get them fired, it's to get them destroyed, it's to put their address online, it's to put their employer online. And yet at the same time, these same companies who claim that QAnon is very dangerous are happy to host these shaming videos. And this is a larger trend, which I've mentioned is really a lot of this oligarchy is crowdsourcing the kind of system we had in the Soviet Union, the kind of system we have in China. It's not being directed solidly from the top down. Instead, it's being crowdsourced through major companies. And if we don't actually push back against these monopolies, we're all going to find ourselves living under something that will make China look very good.
All right, Daniel Greenfield. Daniel, what is your background?
What's my background professionally,
Personally,
educationally? So I got involved in writing about the things that are going on after September 11th. I was in downtown Manhattan on 911. I used to be a lifelong New Yorker. I guess in some ways I'm still a lifelong New Yorker, even though I'm got the hell out of Dodge. But I began writing and engaging in activism and trying to fight back and make sense of what was going on and giving people the tools to understand what was going on. So
okay. I mean, so like a lot of people, I mean, I would put myself there too. You started to become aware and active as a result of 9/11, and you began to ask yourself what kind of hatred was going on there that would have led to this terrible event. And that led to an exploration of the ideologies that were involved. Um, what are you working on right now at Frontpage?
right now, I'm actually digging into a rather insane situation, which is you have every institution now pushing the usual critical race theory stuff, pushing the usual white people are evil stuff. Now, you may have heard of the Folger Shakespeare Library.
No.
It's on Capitol Hill. It's rather famous within certain circles. It contains the world's largest collection of Shakespeare folios. It was set up by a Standard Oil executive. And in case this is a particularly unique niche institution, which is about Shakespeare, and now it's pushing all the usual white people are evil stuff. And this is
What does that have to do with Shakespeare?
Exactly. Well, this is how the left takes over institutions. It takes over every single institution it can get into. And once it has that institution under its control, it's like a hive mind. It begins broadcasting the same message. It's like the Borg on Star Trek are a beehive, or the pod people. The minute that they take over, it begins broadcasting the same signal. So this is just an example of that.
And how can we fight this? I mean, both as individuals and as institutions.
Well, the first thing we need to do is look at what is the left doing, which is what we often are now looking at. The left builds networks, it takes over institutions. We have not been doing that. This is a major problem. I mean, we occasionally try to do that within political institutions, but the left sees all institutions as political. And the left doesn't just, conservatives will sometimes show up to a meeting, They will say Trump is great and we're making America great again. And why are you people such Marxists? And of course, they get laughed at and ridiculed, and the leftist networks do what they can to suppress them. Whereas the leftist doesn't come in into a hostile conservative institution and start saying we need to have a socialist economy. Those are the cranks and they're ineffective. What they do is they come in and say we need to improve things, we need to make things better, and they find like-minded people, they build a network within it, they bring others like it, they take control of it, and increasingly they force out people who don't agree with them, and then they start broadcasting the signal.
And that's how they've taken, I mean, it's the Fabian approach, and that's how they've taken over academia. They've taken over the culture. They've taken over the arts. They've taken over large segments of industry and business and politics and even religion.
Yes.
Anyway, Daniel, listen, I want to thank you very much, as always, for joining me. Great talk. Frontpage Magazine. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you for the work you do.